for the introductions, you know, since we've been going to more of a remote setup here still, we usually forego introductions, but if you can just make sure that your team blurb has your name and your affiliation if you have one, then that's helpful just to help everybody know who's speaking, and we'll use that as introductions instead. So let's see, and as you just heard, this meeting is recorded. We do record and post these meetings on our State Water Board YouTube website. So at this point, any questions about the agenda or anything else before we get going? Okay, and if you have any questions or anything during the presentation, please just feel free to either raise your hand with the Teams thing, or drop a note in chat. And then also, as mentioned, please also make sure that everybody is muted if you're not speaking. And we can go ahead and get going, and I'll turn it over to Chris.
Great. Can everyone hear me?
Oh, you ready? Sorry.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Hi, I'm Chris Taniguchi-Kwan. I'm a senior scientist at Southern California Coastal Water Research Project. I also serve as the environmental flows representative on a work group through the Water Quality Monitoring Council called the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or JEDI work group. One of the main goals of the JEDI, or the Equity Work Group, is to promote justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity initiatives into all of the Water Quality Monitoring Council work groups. And as the eFlows representative, I wanted to give you all just a little update on what's going on. So one of our first tasks is to revise the mission and charters for each of the work groups to include these initiatives, and also to add a goal on increasing diversity among our membership. So I wanted to just share with everyone a draft of an additional objective that I wanted to see if we can add to our scope and objectives in the charter, and then also an additional statement in our membership and representation section of the charter. So I'll just copy and paste the objective, and then the piece on the membership and representation that I want to add to the charter. And I'll also share a link to the entire revised charter to this group. It's a shared Google document, so let me know if anyone has trouble accessing any of the links. And then I also wanted to welcome anyone in this group to join the JEDI work group. We're fairly new. We're open to anyone who wants to join, and we really encourage more people to participate. And one of the goals of this work group is to kind of share ideas, have a forum for everyone to discuss ways that we can include environmental justice and other concerns into all of the work that we're doing in protecting the environment. And so I'll send you a link also to the JEDI work group if you want to join the work group, or if you have any additional questions. So let me put everything in the chat right now. Does anyone have any questions? So I just put in the objective. And then we have the additional statement for the membership and representation section, and then I'll put in the links to the revised charter and the JEDI work group. So if anyone has any comments or suggestions for the charter before we update that and put that live on our eFlows website, just let me or anyone else know. You can shoot us an email or just message in the chat.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
At this point, does anyone have any questions? I'm hearing none, and we can always, after people have a chance to read it a little bit, if at the end of the meeting you do have some questions for Chris, we can take them then. We
Sounds
should have
good.
some extra time today.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Thank you. All right, I believe next up on the agenda
So
is
Dan, there was a question in the chat about
oh,
the link. There's a question in the chat about the links.
Oh, the links are shared on Google Drive, and they're just up on the chat. Mikhail, did that answer your question? Did you find it? Yeah, if you click on the links that are up above your comments, they should take you to the Google Drive and the document. The top one with the G on it. Okay, and if you're still having problems accessing it, you can always shoot me an email, and I'll make sure to get you the link after the meeting too. Just let me know. So next up is our drought updates. This is kind of a round robin, open to anybody. I can go ahead and start off. I did get some updates from staff that were not able to make it for emergency regulations on Mill and Deer Creeks. They have been, the 50 CFS is the flow requirement starting October 15th through now until, usually until somewhere around late May or early June. And that 50 CFS has been met. CDFW staff has also observed Chinook and steelhead migration on both creeks at this point. That's an update on Mill and Deer. And then I wanted to open it up to any other, yes?
Yeah, hey Dan, this is Sam, Sam Cole. I can provide an update for the Russian River.
Great, thank you.
We're continuing to evaluate hydrologic conditions and the potential need for curtailments. At this time, curtailments have been lifted for the entire watershed, so both the upper and the lower. And the last hydrologic modeling forecasts and water availability analysis using the drought methodology suggests that water will continue to be available through March and very likely beyond that. The Russian River Steering Committee is continuing to convene on roughly a bi-weekly basis. And that's kind of the update for that. And then we also have joined us today for the Sacramento and San Joaquin, Jesse Jankowski. If you want to jump in, Jesse, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not a frequent attendee of these meetings, but my name is Jesse Jankowski. I'm a senior engineer in the drought planning, hearings, and special projects section at the water boards. And I'm working on the broader Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta watershed drought regulations. It's kind of similar story. We are continuously evaluating hydrologic conditions, and curtailments have been suspended since early December in the Delta watershed. And in January, we issued an update that curtailments will remain temporarily suspended until further notice. So any changes to those curtailments would go out to our email list. We're not kind of doing any projections further out into the summer at this time, but we are continuously evaluating if and when curtailments may be appropriate for some areas of watershed. We are also working on various refinements to our methodology for some special considerations for areas of the watershed, and more information will be going out to our email list when we have a date and more information for a planned staff workshop on those changes to our water unavailability methodology. I'm happy to take if folks have any questions online or offline. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. I really appreciate you joining us for that update. And then for the Scott and Shasta, we also have Bob Selecki here to provide an update. So appreciate you being here, Bob.
Yeah, sure. Bob Selecki, environmental scientist in the instream flows unit under the supply and demand section. We have suspended curtailments, temporarily suspended curtailments in the Scott and the Shasta. The flow requirement for this month in the Scott is 200 CFS, and the flows are somewhere between 300 and 400 CFS this week. And we're meeting twice a week to evaluate flows in both watersheds. In the Shasta River watershed, the flow requirement there is, what is it, 125 CFS, I think. I should know. And the flows are at about between 150 and 160 CFS in those watersheds. We are considering readoption of the drought emergency regulation in the Scott and the Shasta that would begin in would be implemented in June when the current drought emergency regulation expires. So we're we're closely monitoring what the governor's office evaluation or what they're going to determine for different areas of the state in terms of the drought. And that's what I've got. If there's any questions, please let me know.
All right, thank you, Bob. So those are the water board updates. Does anybody have any questions on any of the water board updates? All right, hearing none at this point. So wanted to open up probably next to CDFW. If CDFW has any drought updates they'd like to share.
Hey guys, I think Jessie usually gives a drought update for our region, but she's in Cancun, so I don't have any updates, but I did want to say I'm gearing up to do outreach for the Voluntary Drought Initiative program in the lower Russian River tribs. And since I have all the water board people here, I'm hoping to maybe use the listserv. But Dan, is that something that's possible?
Yeah, we can send something out on this listserv here. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yeah, because last year we did like actual letters. And so we're thinking, maybe do an email push this year for the mass mailing.
Yeah. That
okay,
sounds
great.
Good. You can just shoot me an email and let me know which list you're interested in sending it out on.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, any other agency updates from any other agencies?
I actually have a question on Jesse's update. Sorry, I didn't get off.
Yep.
Yeah, this is Greg Reese from Kansas City. He mentioned curtailments, but he didn't mention the environmental flows curtailments right now in the Delta. I don't know if he has an update on that, the waiving of the Port Chicago standard.
Yeah, Greg, I apologize. Yes. I do not work in the Bay Delta units, so I could not provide you an update on that right now. I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks. My understanding is that TCP has been submitted to the water board for that, but seemed relevant since it's about a call about environmental flows. Thanks.
You are correct on that front. I unfortunately don't have any other updates, but I can certainly direct you to other staff that do.
All right, and Chris,
thanks.
You have a question?
Yes, hi. Yes, yes. I was wondering if we could get a brief synopsis of how the voluntary curtailments went in the lower part of the Russian River.
Would that be the upper Russian is where the, or do you mean the under the?
Well, CFW gave, said they were considering going to mass emailing instead of letters, if I heard that right. But last year they had the voluntary program for voluntary curtailments, I think it was. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm wondering how that went last year, what kind of participation, and if there was any results from that could be shared.
Yeah, Shay, are
Yeah, so there was a,
still on
oh,
this one's for
that might be a
the
different,
CDFW. Yeah, it's the CDFW
got it.
Voluntary Drought Initiative Program.
Oh yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
The question was,
yes, correct me if I'm, yeah.
how did it go last year with the voluntary program? Like,
Oh,
number of signups
it
and where?
it didn't go very well. We only had, I think actually the only flow release that was active last year under the voluntary drought initiative effort was the Camp Meeker release. But yeah, I think that might have been the only one. Maybe St. Dorothy's Rest, which was also on Dutchville Creek, but we didn't have a lot of luck. I think the drought was really, getting to folks. Some of our normal releases just didn't happen. So this year we're hoping to be more targeted. So just reaching out to people where, it would have the most benefit. So did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
This is Dee Dee. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Dee Dee Diadamo, board member, and I didn't come prepared to talk about this, but with respect to the voluntary water sharing agreement on the Russian, I know that only lasted for a brief period of time, and what prevented it from, maybe going further in a time frame as to what the participants were originally thinking, I think was related to the Potter Valley project and the waiver, and I'm not sure if I'm describing this correctly, but the waiver that they got, that project got from FERC, and that affected the ability of that voluntary water sharing agreement from lasting, for it into some additional time frame.
Yes.
Yes, that's correct.
And go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, the water sharing, and so I think there is some confusion with the terminology because they sound very similar with the voluntary, and I think actually the Russian River Steering Committee has mentioned that they're trying to kind of move away and to potentially dropping the voluntary part of the water sharing program. But yes, it was short-lived, but a success nonetheless. And the committee is still discussing, moving forward with that and generating the report to go into the details of how successful it was and looking at ways to potentially keep this going on in the future. So yes, thank you, Didi. I appreciate that clarification.
Okay, and then I also see Brian McFadden's hand up, probably because I skipped him.
Just a quick update for the group. Brian McFadden with the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. Our board adopted a waiver back in December for low threat activities. I'm getting the name wrong. But at any rate, the item that would be of interest to this group is there's a new category now in that low threat waiver for recharge projects and basically for flood managed aquifer recharge types of projects, so that we can cover those the water quality impacts and screen for any impacts associated with those projects. So that permit is now in place and is implementing the governor's directive for agencies to get those permitting processes in place for recharge. That's it.
Thank you, Brian. It looks like Bob Selecki is next.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just a clarification for me and the group. So what CDFW was talking about with the voluntary initiatives, that's different than what Sam and Dee were talking about, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thanks.
I can provide like a little bit of clarity with the voluntary drought initiative. So it's a joint effort between CDFW and NOAA Fisheries, and it was started in the previous drought. But we're specifically seeking flow enhancement projects. So like flow augmentation projects, groundwater recharge, access for fish monitoring, and things like that. So it's not the the organized voluntary sharing that Sam and Dan are talking about.
Right. Thanks, Shay.
All right, it looks like, Chris, did you have another question?
Yes, for Brian McFadden. Brian, you have some projects identified. Can you name areas of watersheds where, do you know any specific project locations?
Yeah, there's a groundwater recharge project in Scott Valley that's currently in the process of obtaining waiver coverage, and has had their paperwork into the division for a little while. So that's an active project. And then, as far as prospective projects, there's been an effort to develop flood managed aquifer recharge in Alexander Valley in the Russian. That isn't in place, but I think it's on the horizon. And frankly, we're hoping to see more of these projects because it's a great way to store water and for that water to return to streams cold.
Okay, so at this point, I'll open it back up for any other agency updates. All right, hearing none, any other updates from the rest of the group on any drought-related efforts? Okay, we can go ahead and shift gears a little bit now on our updates and move to in-stream flow efforts. So currently, the one that I oversee right now is more related to development of regional in-stream flow requirements for cannabis cultivation. We're still kind of at the ground floor on that effort and are still trying to put together kind of our approach, a general kind of study plan of how we're going to go about developing those regional in-stream flow requirements. Once we get that kind of completed and to a point where we feel we're ready to share, we'll go ahead and add that to one of our upcoming agendas. Hopefully this summer's agenda will be ready to share that information with everybody and give kind of some insight into what we're looking to do to develop the regional in-stream flow requirements. Again, that's just for cannabis cultivation. It would be in the North Coast, what we call the North Coast Policy Area, which is the Eel River north to the boundary of the Klamath. Yes, Chris.
Yes, I was wondering if you have a targeted CFS yet, or is that also under study?
No, that would all be under study.
Okay.
What we're working on is putting together our approach to develop flow criteria. And then as part of that package, how we would go about doing trade-off analysis to help inform flow objective alternatives or environmental flow recommendations.
And that's not going to be voluntary, right?
That is correct. The way the cannabis policy is set up is right now there are statewide interim flow requirements that are incorporated into the existing policy. And then those are in place pending the development of long-term flow requirements for cannabis cultivation. And so these would be, we intend to do that at a regional scale, so region by region to develop those. And so the first one that we're targeting is the North Coast region. And so that would therefore be the development of those long-term flow requirements that would replace the interim flow requirements for that policy area. And for that, we're looking out in the late 2024 to early 2025 timeline is kind of our general timeline. So, we really are kind of trying to transition a little bit more from some of the drought work and shift back into some of that effort. And of course, it depends how the rest of the season sets up as well from a drought perspective. Okay, any other agency in-stream flow effort update? Aaron.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of give everybody an update that the Wildlife Conservation Board's February board meeting is going to be occurring on the 16th. There are several stream flow projects being offered up for consideration by our board and hopefully approval. And so, yeah, exciting time to get some projects on the ground for in-stream flow specifically.
Great, thank you, Aaron. And is there a website link that you could drop in the chat if people are interested in getting the agenda and attending that meeting?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I will do that right now.
Thank you. Bob Spillecki.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I have a lot to update here. So, the in-stream flows unit at the State Water Board, we primarily work on the California Water Action Plan effort, which is a refresher for you folks, 5 pilot watersheds that we're looking to develop in-stream flows in these 5 watersheds: the Ventura River watershed, the Mark West Creek watershed, which is tributary to the Russian River, the South Fork Eel watershed, and the Shasta River watershed, and Mill Creek watershed. Mill Creek is under the Delta. They're evaluating that watershed. Since June of 2021, the unit has been spending most of their time on the Scott Shasta drought effort, and that may continue through this year. But we've been able to work a little bit on California Water Action Plan effort. We do have contractors that are helping us out. And so in the Ventura River, things are complicated. Santa Barbara Channel Keeper sued the State Water Board there, and that's in litigation. And there's ongoing discussions with the city of Ventura and other water users about potential settlement options. There's a groundwater surface water model in the Ventura River watershed and a water allocation model. And of all the watersheds, they've made the most progress in that watershed in development of those models. Development of those models is ongoing. In the Mark West Creek watershed, we're working with, we have USGS under contract, and we're providing funding to them as well as Sonoma County Water Agency for development of the Russian River and Santa Rosa Plain surface water groundwater models. There's also a ModSim model, which is a water allocation model that's being developed, and we're looking to finalize that the end of March of this year. It's going to be close. In the South Fork Eel watershed, surface water groundwater draft model has been developed. It needs to be kind of finalized and calibrated and sent out for public review. And also in the South Fork Eel, we're working with UC Davis and input from technical committee to identify flow ecology relationships in that model. And then in the Shasta River watershed, we have draft surface water, groundwater model and a draft water allocation model. But based on more information we've collected during the Scott Shasta drought period, more it's like water users or big water diverters that we were unaware of. We're going to update, the path forward is to update those models that I just mentioned in the Shasta River watershed. So I don't want to take up all the time here. So that's the update I have from our shop. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, sure.
Chris, did you have a question?
Yes, yes, I do. Thank you. Do these models take into consideration climate change and more and intensive storms and more drought?
I know I don't work on all the models. I work on the Mark West Creek model or with the modeling team on those. I'm not a modeler. And on the Shasta, and I know in the Mark West Creek, there's a climate change scenario. And that's kind of what we're doing in the next 2 or 6 weeks or so on the for the Russian River model, which includes, Mark West Creek, is to look at scenarios, and there is a climate change scenario. And what was the second part of your question, or the other part that I missed?
I think that was it. I was asking about climate change scenarios in the models.
Yeah, and for the Shasta, I haven't worked with that model in about a year, and so I cannot remember. But what we're going back to the Mark West Creek and the South Fork Eel and the Ventura River, the Department of Fish and Wildlife developed flow criteria reports for salmonids. What the flow requirements are at different stages. So we'll look at scenarios in the models with that information in the near future. And like I said, in Mark West Creek, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at, fish flow scenarios there. And they're also doing that in the Ventura. In the Shasta River watershed, we don't have, CDFW hasn't developed a flow criteria report for salmonids in the Shasta.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
Anything else? Yeah, anything else, Chris?
No, that was good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so before we move on, CDFW, did you have any in-stream flow related updates?
I don't. I will mention we completed we're in the process of our review for the drought flow criteria report. But aside from that, I don't want to discuss it maybe in this meeting. Sorry. Until we have our management review it.
Yeah, sounds good. And any other in-stream flow related updates from anybody else? All right, I'm hearing none. So our next agenda item is identifying dry weather water quality goals to inform urban stormwater management in San Diego County. The presenter will be Jacob Morgan with Paradigm Environmental. And just before this one starts, I just wanted to thank them for coming to present today. Sharing presentations on the efforts that are going on is one of the core components of this work group, and we're hoping that that this will help spur folks to start to reach out and let us know that they're ready to get some updates on the efforts that they're working on, so that we can really start to transition this work group to be more of a collaborative workspace with the efforts that everybody's working on in different parts of the state, to both share their what they're working on, lessons learned, or things that they're struggling to put together, or challenges that they're having with their different projects. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jacob. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Everybody see my screen all right?
Yes.
Excellent. My name is Jacob Morgan. I am a water resources engineer at Paradigm Environmental. And Steve, who is on call with me here, and I will be telling you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in San Diego County, using some of the principles from California Environmental Flows Framework. So we've got a little outline of what we'll be talking about. I'll give you a little bit of context around the project. I'll just do a brief overview of the functional flows approach, how we're using it in Spring Valley, and then we'll wrap it up. I'll actually turn it over to Steve to cover some of this project context.
Yeah, I can help you out with that. Thanks, Jacob. I just want to also acknowledge that we have Sherry McPherson and Lara Barrett from San Diego County also here to answer your questions. And this has been an interesting project. I think it's a different use of the environmental flows framework, and answering different types of questions focused primarily on urban stormwater. And so this project came about through the collaboration of County of San Diego Housekeeping, and California Environmental Rights Foundation. And the goal of this project is to develop a multi-benefit stormwater planning approach for the watershed. And so when I mean multi-benefit, I mean looking at wet and dry weather flows, and with a goal towards improving water quality, but also considering other opportunities for community enhancement, water harvesting and use, climate change resiliency, flood control, a number of different auxiliary goals we were looking at for the plan. But it starts with the identification of some water quality goals for Spring Valley Creek. Now, this watershed is not impaired, doesn't have any sort of water quality impairments to downstream. Just to kind of orient you a little bit, this is a watershed. It's a small urbanized watershed in mostly unincorporated San Diego County. It's a tributary to Sweetwater River that discharges to San Diego Bay. And so given that there's no water quality impairments, we necessarily needed to identify some goals that we're going to meet. And for weather bacteria, it tends to be a usual suspect for urban stormwater. There's a number of TMDLs that have been developed throughout the region, including TMDLs for adjacent watersheds. And it tends to show up in monitoring data. And so for wet weather, we identified some goals associated with bacteria. That's an entirely different presentation. We're not going to focus on that. But for dry weather, there is sustained creek flows, and it's primarily fed by two different sources. There are springs in the watershed, which is given the name Spring Valley Creek. But then there's also dry weather runoff associated with typical urban irrigation practices that you all probably are aware of in Southern California. And so, looking at both those sources of water, given the water quality monitoring data, we came up with a novel approach to use the environmental flow recommendations to look at that can consider both the natural flows from the spring as well as some of the urban drool, as we call it, from the urban runoff that occurs during the sustained dry periods, to come up with some solutions, identification, some projects. And so the rest of the bullets here, there's a whole different planning efforts, entire presentation where we look at, identify and prioritize the number of projects that can capture both dry and wet weather flows to meet those goals, and considering all those multi-benefits that I mentioned. There's also climate change modeling being performed to show the resiliency that those projects provide in the face of changing climate and hydrology. There's a hydraulic model looking at the flood control benefits of these as well. And then ultimately, the outcome of the project are a number of metrics that can be used to track the implementation of the plan, and various types of management practices, whether they're structural projects that capture and harvest stormwater, or programmatic practices that attempts to reduce the amount of impervious area, and irrigation practices, and a number of other activities to manage those dry weather flows. So there you go, Jacob.
There we go. Thanks, Steve. As a part of these efforts, we've been doing some hydrological modeling, and that's sort of forms the basis of our environmental flows analysis, particularly the LSPC watershed model that we have for Spring Valley. And so we have a few different model scenarios that we'll use. And so I'll talk about those just briefly. First, we have the existing conditions, which includes all of the sort of developed land areas and land covers, as well as the irrigation. You can see here we have the irrigated pervious area. It's one of the items in our land cover list. And then also the existing conditions, which excludes irrigation. And so this particular model scenario would represent something like the absolute best that we could do in reducing some of that urban drool that Steve was talking about a moment ago. And then the pre-development scenario. So to get at what the natural flows were before irrigation and before development, we have a pre-development scenario that represents those conditions where those land covers have been restored in the model back to those pre-development conditions. Okay. I'll go briefly through the functional flows approach, although I'm sure with this audience, probably not something we have to go into in a lot of detail. Right, so environmental flows, rather than trying to restore the entire flow regime back to some pre-development state, instead we focus on some important components of the natural flow regime that can support or protect some of the native flora and fauna. And then the California Environmental Flows Framework, of course, is based on the 5 functional flow components that represent these different portions of the mean annual hydrograph. And each of these components has characteristics, and these characteristics can be quantified with metrics. So we've got these total of 24 metrics, but as Steve mentioned before, the environmental flows work that we're doing here is primarily focused on dry weather. And so we're going to be focusing primarily here on the dry season base flow magnitudes. So now we'll talk about how we use it in Spring Valley. Here is the CEF framework spelled out. One thing I do want to mention before we get into this is that, as I said at the very beginning, we're using CEF principles here rather than the sort of detailed analysis with the steps and all of that that are a part of CEF. And so if you try to look for all of the steps in what we do, you're not going to find them because that was not our purpose. Instead, we're using some of these broader principles from these 3 different sections. And so in section A, we're looking at the natural flows. What are the ranges of the natural flow metrics? And so using that LSPC model output, we can calculate what our dry season base flows are, or have been historically. And so you can see plotted here on the left, the time series of the dry season median base flow and the dry season high base flow. And then on the right, you can see sort of the statistical distribution of those time series. One thing to note here, the year 2006 is missing, right? These, the functional flows calculator that this relies on uses signal processing algorithms. And so if a signal cannot be detected, then the metrics associated with that signal or that rely on that particular signal cannot be quantified. And so for whatever reason, the base flow for 2006, the dry season base flow for 2006 could not be identified, but we were pretty confident with the remaining years that we had here. And so in section B, we look at some of the perhaps ecological or biological constraints. We are looking at the CSCI and ASCI indices. Right, CSCI is sort of a general stream condition index, whereas ASCI is particularly focused on algae. And so we'll actually focus more on the ASCI than the CSCI as well. And so one of the things that SQUIRP has done is related changes in functional flow metrics to the probability or change the probability of achieving good indices of both CSCI and ASCI. And so this is just an example of one of those relationships. There are many others for other metrics, and of course for CSCI as opposed to just ASCI, which you see here. And the H out front of ASCI just stands for hybrid, just so you know. And so we can use these relationships between changes in functional flow metrics and ASCI and CSCI to evaluate how the outputs from our different model scenarios perform or compare with natural conditions, right? So for we'll jump to section C for that. And so in section C, we actually start looking at assessing the different flow alteration scenarios. And so on the top left, what you see here is dry season median base flow. You can see the current or the undeveloped condition, which we had before, represents sort of the natural conditions. You can see the no irrigation, which is this darker blue, and then the dark blue is the current, which includes irrigation, right? And on the right, you can see how the distribution of those time series works out. And then the same for dry season high base flow, excuse me, at the bottom here. Okay. And so one thing that you could notice from these is that the difference between the current and the no irrigation, as I mentioned before, is sort of the best that we could do. And so you see those highlighted here on the right. And we'll be focusing primarily on the median base flow parameter. And so if you'll remember from a few slides ago, those ASCI and CSCI probabilities were based on the change in metrics. And so I have plotted here the time series of delta dry season median base flow. And this is represents the change from natural conditions to either the no irrigation condition, which you see on the bottom here, and the current condition, which you see in the darker blue at the top. And so you can see, for example, that the no irrigation condition stays pretty close to this 0 line, while the current condition sort of hangs out up here closer to the 0.2 CFS line with quite a bit more noise. And so then we can use these delta metrics with those relationships to get our time series of the probability of good indices. And so here we have the probability of good CSCI plotted, and then probability of good ASCI. And like I said, we'll be focusing primarily on the ASCI. And one thing to notice is that in the no irrigation scenario, probability of having good ASCI is quite high, which makes sense if you recall several slides back, the distribution of median base flow magnitude for the no irrigation scenario was actually quite close to the natural scenario that we modeled. And so what we are wanting to do is to see if we can get this current scenario closer to the no irrigation scenario. And so how much flow would need to be reduced in order to match that. And so that's what we have shown here. So we have how much of the current flow would need to be reduced percentage-wise in order to match either the undeveloped or the no irrigation scenario. And you can see that at about 50%, we match either one. And so by reducing those base flows by 50% in order to match the no irrigation scenario, we also can match sort of the natural conditions during the dry season for that base flow metric. So just it's a matter of conclusion and summary. We are focusing on the dry season median base flow using CSCI and ASCI as our ecological indicators. We found that by reducing flows by 50%, reducing the dry season base flows by 50%, that we're able to match undeveloped base flows, and so match the undeveloped or natural ecological indicators as well. We'd be happy to take some questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Jacob and Steve. Anyone with any questions? Let's see here. Kimberly.
Yeah, another really basic question, but just kind of what are the species that you're managing for there, and what are the likelihoods that irrigation can be reduced?
Steve, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, well, I think the ecological curves that SCORP developed were focused on Southern California. So, we utilize what Eric and Chris developed, but I think we would need to defer to them in terms of the specific species that those curves represent.
I guess, Steve, I can jump in.
Yeah.
I'll get my camera on. So those curves, Kim, Kimberly, the curves, the CSCI and ESCI curves, so just taking a step back, remember that the functional flows approach under CEF is really designed more to focus on overall ecological health, is kind of the premise of CEF, versus a specific targeted species like a salmonid or an amphibian. And so because we're taking a more holistic approach and looking at overall ecological health, we use the two bioassessment indicators, which are more reflective of kind of the general ecological condition of the stream community. And so we don't have sort of a target species per se, but we're trying to manage flows to protect the overall ecology, as reflected by those two bioassessment indices that Jacob presented. And so that's kind of the premise of this work. And I think this is a really interesting application of CEF in a very sort of specific local application. So it's great to see that. So I don't know, did that answer your question about the specific species?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, just and then what are the chances of that actually being able to reduce the demands from irrigation at that critical times?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the only other thing I'd say is, one thing that we've been doing in other projects in Southern California, as well as the work that Dan mentioned earlier on the cannabis policy, is, looking if you do have specific species of concern, like say we have, in this area, we have things like the arroyo toad, which are federally listed. You can look at, if you know something about the flow needs of that species, you can sort of cross-reference those flow needs back against the functional flow ranges that Jacob presented as a way of confirming that those ranges are also protective of the needs of that particular species, right? So you can always do that cross-validation to determine whether those flow ranges are also going to be protective of those species. And if the answer is no, then you can, layer on additional management on top of that to accommodate those particular species.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then Jacob and Steve, there was a second part to that question was, what do you see as opportunity for success to reduce the inputs from irrigation?
So you mean in terms of the projects and how that would be done? So it's kind of interesting. I mean, because the wet weather goal for fecal coliform result necessarily requires a lot of management of water, and we're talking about diversions of storm drains to. You could just picture these big infiltration galleries that would be above the surface or underground within parks. And also a lot of green infrastructure within the watershed. But that's not all. Those are just the structural projects needed to address the wet weather, but it will have an impact on dry weather flows. In terms, those trickle of flows tend to enter those types of projects and not leave because they're pretty big to handle wet weather. But then also the county does have a number of programs to reduce irrigation demands, and then those wet weather projects that do collect and store water, that water can certainly be used and treated for on-site irrigation of these parks to reduce some of the irrigation demands. It can be diverted to the sewer system for larger scale countywide initiatives for purple pipe and that kind of thing, to reduce irrigation demands. And so as kind of a higher meeting, and this is sort of a pilot project for this watershed that the county intends to replicate for other watersheds. So it's just kind of starting the ball rolling, in terms of irrigation reduction. But the county does have other programs in place that does attempt to just reduce irrigation in general and do some xeriscaping and smart plantings and that sort of thing.
Great, thank you. Chris Millen.
Yes, I was wondering if you could speak to the dry season CFS flow and how reducing the drool, so 50% reduction in current dry season base flow is to help reduce the irrigation drool, I guess you're calling it. and how that affects the water quality. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we do have water quality
have-
modeled. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that the model is calibrated for simulation of total nitrogen, total phosphorus, various copper, lead, zinc, and indicator bacteria. And so we actually are simulating dry weather, different concentrations of constituents during those periods, and which, I know that the Coastkeeper and SURF, who I mentioned, who are participants in this project, are very interested in methods to address nutrients, and that's where I thought the ASCI provided kind of a good surrogate, and instead of attempting to identify, let's say, a water quality or nutrient goal that is associated with any sort of eutrophication or excess algal growth or other things that requires a pretty intensive analysis and a different set of models. So I guess my point is that with this reduction of flow, the environmental flows provides a good surrogate as a goal to provide an indication of the reduction of dry weather flows that could sustain at least a natural condition in the stream. But we are tracking with the, once we have all those projects that we've identified, those do go back into the model, and we are simulating them, and we did a check. So for instance, we put all the projects in the model, we demonstrated with the model that those projects are going to enable us to meet the wet weather goal. And then we actually simulated a dry period with those projects in place and showed that the dry weather goal is actually exceeded. We dried it up too much, and we just know that in those, when we actually engineer and design those projects, we have to put some thought into making sure that we're maintaining a flow in the creek. And so it has to be an engineering system. And then there'll be continued tracking in the future, monitoring to continue to check some of the different pollutant concentrations and make sure that everything is balanced and in place. So it's more like a decision support system and an adaptive management framework to support the county as they implement the plan in the future.
Can you speak to any of the best management practices other than reducing irrigation during the drought? I mean, if I'm getting what you're saying here, does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're reducing irrigation to reduce the drool, to improve the water quality in the dry season base flow of Spring Valley Creek.
Well, I'd say that's one of the tools in the toolbox. So, there's a lot of investment of some structural projects to meet the wet weather goals. So I mentioned the big infiltration gallery that can be underneath the park. There's other projects that are in Caltrans rights of way and other locations where the water is diverted from certain streams within the watershed, and they can be treated and returned back. Yeah. And then there's green infrastructures like green streets, bioretention, greening the environment, and all these have that community benefit of providing park improvements, greening, working some of the green infrastructure within the safe routes to school and other, trees, all that kind of stuff goes with it. But I would say that the programmatic activities for reduced irrigation are part of that toolbox. And through the adaptive management framework, there will be that balancing act in terms of how much the structural versus non-structural types of activities would be needed to maintain that flow.
Wow, that really helped a lot to help me see the whole picture. So I appreciate you adding that narrative. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Any other questions? All right, hearing none. Thank you again, Paradigm, for coming and presenting on your project. And again, another plug for future meetings to keep this going and to include more of these types of presentations. I think they're really helpful for the group to hear. So if you're working on any in-stream flow related efforts or restoration type projects that are designed to improve in-stream flows and habitat quality, please send me an email. We can get you on the agenda in upcoming meetings, which also brings us to potential agenda topics for our next meeting. If anybody had any flagged at this point that you wanted to mention. Let's see, Conrad.
Hi. Yeah, for next meetings, the opening topic was excellent. I'm glad this body is starting to talk about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. As a lot of you know, the state board is undergoing a similar process. They adopted a racial equity action plan, the regional board as well. And kind of a reoccurring topic I have brought up is how the CEFF transition from section B based on science to section C in and of itself is politicizing science. So I think it would be worthwhile talking about how the scientific community can make recommendations based on objectives of existing law and not based on politics, and how that relates to racial equity. And just one comment on what was written in the racial equity document that was shared. There's always talk about getting the right people to the table, but at this case, the river-dependent communities, particularly tribes, have for 20 years been telling the water board and in-stream flow scientists what they want, which is enough water for salmon to not go extinct, among other things. So more engagement is fine and dandy, but what's really, really needed for justice and equity is to do what river-dependent communities have been asking for decades. And then I'm going to put Hastings Environmental Law Review journal article in the chat that speaks directly to this, not in the context of racial equity, but it gets right at the fundamental problems with CEF section B to C. So I'll be quiet there.
Okay, thank you, Conrad. It might be helpful maybe if you could help us put together that agenda item, or maybe if you wanted to lead the presentation on it. I think as far as maybe some of the challenges that you're aware of on that would be helpful. And I think maybe we could start there with presenting the challenges themselves, and then start to move the conversation maybe into what's next. But again, it's kind of that, for this working group, it's that fine line where, you know, this is not a regulatory working group, so we try to navigate that as best as we can. But I think the first component that you mentioned is really important. You know, what are the challenges that are being faced? What's the background and history of those challenges, and so on and so forth, and then start to figure out how we can, you know, different ways that we can potentially move forward from there. Does that make sense?
Sure. And I would just say step one, read the article I put in the post, and I'm not asking that this be a regulatory article body. I'm asking that it not be politicized in such a way that it upholds historic injustice.
Yes, we certainly would not want this working group to be doing so.
Well, section C
so
is,
maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and maybe you can shoot me an email. We can set up a time to talk and kind of go form some outline for the presentation. That sound good?
Sure, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, anybody else? Let's see, Chris Milan has your hand up.
Thank you, Daniel. I was wondering if at the next CEF work group Zoom, can you give us some kind of an update? At the last meeting, we talked, or I mentioned, you know, having an update with what CEF is doing with the Department of Water Resources regarding Sigma, if there's any kind of dialogue going on for the groundwater sustainability plans to have, you know, there a lot of them are lacking in groundwater, surface water protection from pumping, and using CEF to help the counties get to more protections of surface water. And I'm wondering if that's happening at DWR.
Yeah, we can look into that. I don't know if we have anybody from DWR that's on our meeting today that could speak to that at all. If it would be a quick update today. Not to put you on the spot. Not hearing anyone. So yeah, we'll try to track that down for you, Chris. And present
Yeah,
something on
because
it.
as
Hopefully
you
we can get
know,
DW.
yeah, okay,
We've been
thank
working to get DWR more engaged in this working group. So we can reach back out and see if we can get them to come to our next meeting to present.
And Dan, this is Eric. I think that I can work with you offline, but I know there's also some local groundwater GMAs, groundwater management agencies that are doing what Chris talked about, right? And trying to incorporate SEF into the development of the groundwater sustainability plan. So I can work with you offline to maybe see if we can get one of those local water districts to participate and talk about what they're doing.
Okay, that sounds great, Eric. Thank you. And Nick, Jocelyn.
I was hoping a future agenda item could be just a follow-up on the Little Shasta River project and where it goes next.
Okay. Anybody else have any other agenda items?
Oh, Dan, this is Chris. I just wanted to say that I can help you and Conrad on the DEI discussion agenda item that Conrad brought up.
Great, thank you, Chris. That would be awesome.
Okay.
All right, not hearing any other agenda items. Any other last wrap-up items that anybody has to flag? Hearing none. So thank you all for attending today. And Conrad and Chris, we'll schedule a meeting to get together and talk further. Oh, and one other item I almost forgot to mention is Chris T shared the JEDI Initiative update to our working group. Our plan next meeting is to hear any comments back that anybody might have, and if not, move forward with incorporating those updates into our formal charter. All right. Thank you all and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank
Dan.
you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.